The river came up in the dark, and by the time the bells began to ring it was already in the low cottages. I had stood beside my duke through 3 campaigns and more skirmishes than I care to number, and I had thought I knew what water could do to a man. I was wrong. I had never seen anything move the way the Greywater moved that night, black and shalmed, and faster than a horse could run, carrying gates and hen coops and whole hayricks down toward the weir as if they weighed nothing at all. I was the one who woke him. I remember my fist against his door and the way he was already dressed when he opened it, as though a soldier never truly sleeps. "How bad?" he said, not a question. Julian Vane, the War Duke of Greywater, never wasted a word on a question when the answer was already in another man's face. "The bridge is going, Your Grace. The whole lower valley's under water. Croft's people are on their roofs." He was moving before I finished. "Rouse the stables, every rope in the house. Send Barrow to ring the church bell till his arms give out. I want every soul in this valley awake." He took the stairs 3 at a time, and I, who am 10 years his senior and feel each of them, went after him into the wet and roaring night. You must understand the man to understand the night. The valley feared him. They had cause, they thought. He had come home from the wars with a seam of scar across his jaw and a stillness in him that folk took for coldness, and he did not smile at the market or dance at the assemblies or do any of the small warm things a valley likes its lord to do. They called him the War Duke behind their hands, and not kindly. What they did not know, what only I knew who had carried the ledger for him, was that he kept a book. A plain soldier's ledger, and in it, in his own hand, the name of every man who had died under his command. He read it the way other men read Scripture. He had come home not cold but emptied. A man who had learned in the worst school there is that you cannot save the dead, and had sworn some private oath that he would never again stand on dry ground and watch the living go under. I did not know, when we rode out that night, that the river would put that oath to the cruelest test of his life. Nor did I know the name Marion Pell. Before dawn I would know both. We came down the hill with lanterns and a dozen of his men, and the water met us sooner than we thought it would. It had swallowed the water meadow entire. The willows stood up out of it to their waists, thrashing. Across the drowned field the bridge, the old stone bridge that had stood since his grandfather's grandfather, was a black hump with the river standing white against its upstream arches, and I could see even at that distance that it would not stand the hour. And on the near side, on the last tongue of dry ground before the flood, there was a crowd. The valley gentry mostly. Sir Holly's Bray in his greatcoat with his grooms about him, and the Marchams and old Fenwick the magistrate, the people who had land above the flood and horses to carry them to it. They had come out to watch. They stood with their lanterns held high and their faces long, saying to one another what a dreadful thing it was, and doing precisely nothing, because the water was cold and the dark was full of drowned things, and none of them could see what could be done. The Duke rode straight into the middle of them, and they parted like a hedge. "Who is still down there?" he said. "Your Grace." Sir Holly's Bray came forward, all concern, all uselessness. "There is nothing to be done tonight. The Croft family, we believe they are on the roof, but no man could reach them across that. It would be throwing lives after lives. In the morning, when the water—" "In the morning they will be dead," the Duke said. "Who else is down there?" It was not Bray who answered. It was a boy, a stable lad, soaked to the bone and shaking, who had pushed up out of the dark holding to my Duke's stirrup as though it were the one solid thing in the world. "The schoolmistress, my lord," the boy gasped. "Miss Pell, she went in." "She went in." The Duke's voice did not rise, but something in it changed, the way the air changes before a storm breaks. "Went in where?" "After the Croft little one, my lord. The babby got swept off the wall when the garden went. And Miss Pell, she'd come down to help bring the folk out of the low houses. She'd been at it an hour, going door to door, and when the little one went in, she didn't even stop to put down her shawl, my lord. She went in after it." The boy's teeth were chattering so that I could barely make the words. She got hold of it. I saw. She got hold of it and she was fighting for the willows, but the water took them both down toward the weir, my lord, and nobody would. He could not finish. He did not need to. Every man on that bank knew what was at the weir. The weir was where the whole weight of the flood was pouring over in a white roaring wall, and beneath it the water turned back on itself in a churn that would hold a man under and not give him back. I looked at the faces of the gentry then, and I will not soon forget them. Not cruel faces, only frightened, only comfortable, only certain that some things cannot be done. Sir Holly's Bray had his mouth open to say again that it was hopeless, that no man could reach the weir across a mile of floodwater in the black of night, that to try was madness. He never got to say it. My Duke was already turning his horse. "Elias," he said to me, "the long rope, the good one, and the gray. She's the only one who'll take the water without losing her head." He was stripping off his greatcoat as he spoke, and his sword belt after it, everything heavy, everything that would drag a man down. "The rest of you ride the near bank down to the weir fast as you can and keep your lanterns up. When I come to it, I'll need light and I'll need hands. Move." "Your Grace," it was Fenwick the magistrate now, an old man, not unkind. "Julian. It's 9 miles round by the near bank to the weir road, and the near bank's half gone. And across to her you cannot cross that. You'll drown, and for a schoolmistress, forgive me, for a girl who came to us from nowhere with nothing, who teaches the cottagers' children their letters for a few shillings a quarter. She is a good soul, I don't deny it, but she is nobody, Julian. You are the last of your name. I cannot let you throw it into that river." My Duke looked down at him from the gray's back, and when he spoke it was quietly, almost gently, and it silenced that whole bank more surely than any shout. "There is no such thing," he said, "as a woman who is nobody. I learned that in a country you have never seen, from men you would have called nobody, who died so that you could stand here dry and call them so." He gathered the reins. "She went into the water for a child that was not hers, while 40 men who could swim stood on the bank and watched. If that is nobody, then I have spent my whole life fighting for the wrong people. Light the way to the weir." And he put the gray at the flood. I have followed that man into places that still visit me at night, but I think the truest measure of him was taken in the next hour, and there was no enemy in it but the water and the dark and the 9 cruel miles. The near bank road was gone in 3 places, and we swam the horses through, lanterns hissing, ropes paying out and snatching taut. Twice I thought we had lost him ahead of us in the black. Twice his voice came back to us out of the roar, steady, giving orders, holding us together the way he had held broken squares together when the world was coming apart, and we followed the sound of him because there was nothing in that valley worth following more. You will want to know about her, and I will tell you what I came to know, though I did not know it yet as we rode. Marion Pell had come to the valley 2 winters before with a small trunk and a smaller purse, and no family that anyone could name. She had taken the cold room over the wheelwrights and opened her little school in the tithe barn, and she taught the children of people who could barely spare them from the fields, taught them letters and figures, and on Sundays, taught the ones who wanted it to read the Psalms for themselves. The valley's fine people were civil to her and no more. She was not asked to their houses. She mended her own gowns and turned her own hems, and was, by every measure the gentry kept, exactly the nobody old Fenwick had named her. And she was, at that hour, somewhere ahead of us in the dark with a child in her arms and the weir pulling them both down, and every yard we made felt like a yard too slow. We heard the weir before we saw it, a sound you feel in your chest before your ears own it, a great white sustained roar. Then the near bank men's lanterns came up ahead, a ragged line of light along the drowned meadow, and in their glow we saw the water for what it was. The whole flood was funneling down and pouring over the weir's lip in a curtain, and below it the churn stood up in standing waves, brown and white and terrible. Anything that came down the river came to the weir. Nothing that went under it came up on this side. There, one of the men was shouting, pointing. There, my lord, in the willows, she's caught in the willows above the weir. I saw her then for the first time. There was an old line of pollarded willows that had stood at the meadow's edge and now stood half-drowned 20 yards out into the flood, and the river had swept her against them and she had caught. She had one arm hooked over a willow branch and the whole force of the river dragging at her, and in the crook of her other arm, held up out of the water against the trunk, was the child. She was not screaming. That is the thing I remember. That is the thing that told me before I ever spoke to her what manner of woman she was. She had been in that cold, black water God knows how long, at the very lip of the weir with death roaring 6 feet below her, and she was not screaming and she was not flailing. She was holding on and she was keeping the child's face up, and she was, when the branch swung her round toward the light, looking at us with a white steady face as if to say, "I have done my part. Now do yours." The branch would not hold much longer. I could see it bending, see the willow's roots working in the softened bank, and I knew, and my Duke knew, that when it went it would put them both into the weir. "Rope," he said, and I had it to him. He knotted it round himself with the quick, sure hands of a man who has done desperate things before, and he flung the coil to me. "You and 4 men on the tail of this. When I've got them, you haul, and you do not stop hauling whatever happens. Do you hear me, Elias? Whatever happens, you haul us in." He looked at me once. In 20 years he had never once told me he trusted me. He told me then, without a word, with a look, "Keep the light on the child." "Julian," I said, which I had not called him since we were young men, "it's the weir." "I know what it is," he said, and I understood that he had known from the moment the boy said she went in, had known the whole 9 miles what he was riding toward, and had never once thought of turning back. "I have watched enough of them go under," he said. "I'm done watching." And he went in below the willows, letting the river take him down toward her on a paid-out rope, and the current snatched him and drove him, and I felt the line burn out through my hands with 4 grown men behind me leaning back against it. He was under, then up, then under. I lost him, found him in the lantern light, an arm, the dark of his head. And then the rope went suddenly, sickeningly slack, and my heart stopped in my chest. And then it snapped bar tight again so hard it took 2 of us off our feet, and a man beside me shouted, "He's got 'em. He's got 'em both, my Lord Haul." I will not pretend I remember the hauling clearly. There is a kind of work a man does with his whole body and no part of his mind, and that was such work. We hauled against a river that did not want to give them up. The willow went. I heard the crack of it over the roar, and I felt the sickening extra weight as the branch's mercy was taken away, and the full flood had them. And still we hauled, our heels plowing furrows in the drowned meadow, the rope steaming in the cold air with the friction of it, and the near-bank men flinging themselves onto the line one after another, until there must have been a dozen of us dragging 3 lives back from the weir by main strength and stubbornness, and nothing else. They came up out of the shallows into the lantern light all tangled together, and I have seen many things, but I will remember that one when I have forgotten my own name. My Duke on his knees in a foot of racing water, streaming, gasping, his arms locked round the both of them and refusing even then to open, and Marion Pell with her head fallen back, and her lips gone blue and no sound in her at all, but the child, the Croft child, coughing. Coughing and then wailing, that thin furious wail of a living thing that has been very nearly a dead one, the finest sound I ever heard in my life. "The child lives," someone was shouting, passing it back to the reaching hands of the women who had run down the bank. "The child lives." But my Duke was not looking at the child. He had laid her down on the wet grass, Marion, though I did not have her name yet, and he was bent over her with a stillness that frightened me worse than all the roaring water, because I knew that stillness. I had seen it on his face over men on other fields. It was the stillness of a man reading a name to write into his ledger. "No," he said, "just that." He put his hands to her and he pressed the water from her hard, the way the army surgeons had taught us, and he said it again, low only to her, as though the whole flooded valley had gone silent and there were only the 2 of them. "No, not you. You went in for a child that was not yours. You do not get to be a name in the book. Breathe. And I stood there in the freezing dark, an old soldier who thought himself past weeping, and watched the war duke of Greywater, the cold man, the feared man, the man who did not dance at the assemblies, kneel in the flood over a poor schoolmistress the valley had called nobody, and beg her to breathe. She breathed. It came out of her all at once, a great retching gasp, and then river water, and then air, dragged down into her in whooping breaths, and her hands came up and clawed at his coat front, and her eyes flew open, and the very first thing that woman said, half-drowned, blue-lipped, back from the very brink of the weir, was, The little one, The child is safe, my Duke said. The child is crying its head off in its mother's arms this minute. You saved it, be still now, you're safe. She looked up at him. I do not think she knew him. I do not think in that moment she knew he was the Duke at all, only that some man with a scarred jaw and eyes like a winter sea had her by the shoulders and would not let her go, and had, by the evidence, dragged her out of the river. Her face, when she understood the child had lived, is another thing I will not forget. Whatever the valley had done to her, whatever cold rooms and turned hems and civil neglect had taught her about her own small worth, in that one moment she looked as though she had been handed the whole world. Then it was worth it, she whispered. And her eyes closed, and I thought we had lost her after all. But it was only that she had fainted at last, now that she was allowed to. He carried her up the bank himself, would not let another man take her. Sir Holly's Bray came forward with his greatcoat, all changed now, all eager to be of use in the safe aftermath, and my Duke took the coat from him without a word and wrapped it round her and lifted her against his chest and carried her to where the horses were, and Bray trailed after saying that of course she must be taken to the workhouse infirmary. It was the proper place. They would see her tended there. She is going to Greywater, my Duke said, in a voice that ended the discussion. She is going to my house, and my own physician will sit with her tonight, and she will have a warm room and a fire and every care my house can give, and if any man here has an objection he may make it to me in the morning when this child's mother has finished thanking her. He looked round at all of them then, the whole shivering crowd of them, the ones who had watched from dry ground. You came out to see a drowning, he said. You may go home now. There will not be one. And he set her on the grey before him, and put his arm about her, and turned for home. Greywater was 3 miles up the valley on the high ground, above anything the river could reach, and we brought her into it near dawn with the sky going grey behind us and the flood still roaring at our backs. I rode close at his side the whole way. He said nothing. He held her against him with one arm and rode with the other, and every little while I saw him lower his head to listen, not to her words, for she said none, but to her breathing, the way a man listens for a wounded comrade in the dark. The house woke to us. Lights came up window by window as we clattered into the courtyard, and Mrs. Fenn, the housekeeper, came out onto the steps with a shawl over her nightgown and her mouth open to scold whatever fool was making such a noise. And then she saw what he carried, and every other thought went out of her. The blue room, my Duke said, coming down off the grey with her still in his arms. The one that catches the morning sun. Fires every fire in that wing and hot bricks in the bed, and send Colby down for Dr. Aldous, and don't let him say the roads are bad. Tell him the roads are bad and he is to come anyway. Warm milk, warm broth when she can take it. Dry linen. Go. Mrs. Fenn was a sensible woman and did not waste a breath asking who the drowned girl in Sir Holly's Bray's greatcoat might be. She went, and within the hour that cold, quiet house was transformed into something I had not seen it be in all the years since he came home from the wars. It was warm and it was busy, and it had a purpose, and the purpose was to save a life. Maids ran with warming pans. The great kitchen fire was built up until you could feel it 3 rooms off. And in the blue room, Marion Pell was laid at last in a warmed bed with the morning sun just beginning to reach the sill, and Dr. Aldous, who did come, the roads being no obstacle to a summons in that tone, bent over her and did his work, and came out at length wiping his hands and looking, I thought, cautiously less grim than he had gone in. "She is very cold, and she has swallowed a deal of river," he told the Duke in the passage. I stood by. My Duke had not asked me to leave, and I had not thought of going. There is a danger of the lung fever after such a chill, and I will not tell you there is none. But her heart is strong, and she is young, and your Grace, forgive me, but I have never in 30 years of practice seen a constitution so well governed. She woke while I worked. She was in pain and half frozen, and she apologized to me. She apologized for the trouble, and then she asked after the child and after the Croft family on their roof, and after a woman named Sadie who she said was lame and lived by the ford and might not have got out. He shook his head slowly. I have attended duchesses who thought less of the whole world in a year than that girl thought of it lying half drowned in your blue room. Keep her warm. Keep her still. If the fever comes, we will fight it. I think she means to live. I saw my Duke's shoulders come down a fraction, the way a man's do when a weight he will not name is eased. Sadie by the ford is out and safe, he said. The Croft family came off their roof at first light. I had men on it. Tell her that. When she wakes, someone is to tell her all of it, every soul that lived, before she has a chance to ask. Do you understand me? She is not to wake into worry. I understand you, your Grace, said Dr. Aldous, and I think perhaps he understood rather more than the instruction. The fever did come. It came that evening, and it stayed 3 days, and they were the longest 3 days I have spent out of a war. I will not pretend I understood at the outset of them the whole of what I was watching. I had known my Duke a long time. I had seen him grieve in his stone-faced way, and I had seen him rage under a stillness, and I had seen him carry the dead. I had never once seen him sit. He sat with her. That is the plain fact of it, and it undid every notion the valley had of him, and in truth it undid a few of mine. He had 100 things that ought to have taken him from that room. The flood had wrecked the lower valley, cottages down, the mill race broken, families to be housed and fed, and he saw to all of it. He was tireless about all of it, riding out and giving orders and opening his barns and his purse. But he did it in snatches, and between each snatch he came back, and he sat in the hard chair by the blue room's bed with his soldier's ledger unopened on his knee, and he watched her breathe. On the second night, the worst of it, when she was talking out of the fever, calling out lessons, poor soul, saying, "Mind your letters, Tom," the bee faces the other way, teaching her little school in her sleep even then. I came in with fresh candles and found him leaning close, and he was doing a thing I had never known him do. He was talking to her. Low, steady, the way he had talked to her in the river. "You have a school to keep," he was saying. "I have been to see it, did you know that, while you have been lying here idle? I walked down to your tithe barn and I looked at it, and it is a disgrace, Miss Pell. The roof leaks over the very bench where you sit the youngest ones, and there is one window that will not close, and you have been teaching a valley's children in a barn in the cold on a schoolmistress's few shillings a quarter, and you never once thought to come up to the great house and ask the Lord of it for a dry roof. Well, you will have to live now and come and shout at me about it, because I have given orders to mend it, and I will very likely do it wrong, and then where will your children be?" A pause. Her fevered muttering had quieted, whether from the fever's own tide or from the sound of him I could not say. "Live," he said, "and scold me. I find I would like to be scolded. It has been a long time since anyone in this valley was not afraid of me. Live, and I promise you I will do 100 things wrong on purpose, only to hear it." I set down my candles very quietly and went out, and did not tell him I had heard. For some things a man is not meant to witness in another, and I loved him too well to let him know he had been witnessed. She broke the fever on the 3rd night. Mrs. Fenn came to fetch me near 2 in the morning with her candle shaking and her face all lit up, and I went in, and my Duke was standing at the bedside, standing at last, not sitting, and Marion Pell was awake. Truly awake, the fever gone out of her eyes and sense come back into them, pale as the linen and thin already from the ordeal, but herself. And she was looking up at him with a wondering sort of confusion. a woman trying to fit together a world that had rearranged itself around her while she slept. "You are the Duke," she said. Her voice was a thread. "You are the War Duke. I remember the river. It was you in the river." A frown gathered on her poor tired face. "But that cannot be right. Why would the Duke of Greywater be in the river?" "Because you were in it," he said simply. "But I am," and here it came, the thing the valley had taught her, the thing she believed as plainly as she believed her own name. "I am nobody, your grace. I am the schoolmistress. You could have sent a man." He was quiet a moment. Then he drew the hard chair to the bedside and sat, so that his face was level with hers, and he spoke to her with a gentleness I did not know was in him. "Miss Pell," he said, "I want you to listen to me because I am going to tell you something true, and I do not think anyone has troubled to tell it to you before." He paused. "I have commanded a great many men. I have watched a great many of them die, and I keep their names in a book, and I read it so that I will not become the kind of man who forgets that they were each of them somebody. Do you understand? There is no such thing as nobody. There was never any such thing. It is a lie the comfortable tell about the good, so that they need not stir themselves. You went into a flood for a child that was not yours while 40 men who could swim stood on the bank and consulted their consciences. That is not what nobody does. That is what the bravest soul in this valley does. And I did not send a man, Miss Pell, because there was not a man in the valley worth sending. There was only me, and I would have gone through the weir itself before I let that river have you." She looked at him for a long, long moment. And then Marion Pell, who had not screamed in the flood, who had apologized to the doctor for the trouble, who had asked after every soul but herself, she turned her face into the pillow and wept, not from grief. I have seen grief, and it was not that. It was the weeping of a person who has been cold a very long time and is set, all at once, too near a fire, the body's own protest at an unaccustomed warmth. He did not touch her. He only sat and let her weep and was there, which I have come to think is the whole of what most of us ever truly want from another soul, not to be saved, though he had saved her, but afterward simply not to be left alone with it. "You should rest," he said at last, when the storm of it had passed. "You are safe here, and you may stay as long as you have need, and there is not one thing in the world you must do tomorrow but breathe and mend. Sleep now." "Your Grace." She caught at his sleeve as he rose, a small, bold thing, and I saw it cost her something, and I saw it please him more than she could know. "The children, my school, 3 days they will think I have." "Your school has a new roof going on it this week," he said, "and your children have been told that their teacher is a hero who is resting at the great house, and half of them have picked flowers that Mrs. Finn has been putting in water in the still room until you are well enough to see them, and the pile is becoming an embarrassment to the household. Sleep, Miss Pell. The valley is holding its breath for you to be well. Let it." And she slept. I have called this the story of a rescue, and so it is. But a rescue from a river is the work of an hour, and the other rescue, the slower one, the one where a whole valley is dragged out of an old cold habit of the heart, that took the season, and it was the better thing to watch. Because the valley did wake to what she had done. It could not help it. The story ran up and down the Greywater like the flood itself. How the poor schoolmistress had gone into the water for the Croft babe while the gentry watched, and how the War Duke had ridden 9 miles through the drowned dark and gone into the weir itself to pull her out. The cottagers, who had always liked her in their quiet way, made a kind of saint of her, and the gentry, who had always overlooked her, found the ground shifting under their fine shoes. It is an uncomfortable thing to have watched from dry land while a nobody did the bravest deed of the year. Sir Holly's Bray discovered a sudden warm concern for the schoolmistress's welfare, and sent up a basket of hothouse grapes. The Marcham ladies, who had never once thought to ask Miss Pell to tea, began to speak of her as that dear brave girl, and to imply, in the way such people do, that they had always known there was something fine in her. My Duke watched all of it with a cold, clear eye. He was not a man to be gulled by a season's fashion of the heart, but he did a thing about it that I thought was very like him, and very like the whole shape of what he was becoming. When Marion was well enough to come downstairs, pale still and thin, wrapped in a shawl Mrs. Fenn had knitted her, moving slow, he did not hide her away, and he did not let the valley have her cheaply either. He gave a dinner. A great dinner at Greywater, the first the house had held since he came home from the wars, and he asked all of them. The Brays and the Marchams and Fenwick the magistrate and every fine family in the valley, and he asked, too, the Croft family, cottagers though they were, and the wheelwright and his wife who had let Miss Pell her cold room, and this was the stroke of it. He had her seated not below the salt with the humble folk where the gentry expected to find her, but at his own right hand, at the head of his own table, in the place of the highest honor in the house. I was there, I would not have missed it. I watched the gentry file in and find the schoolmistress in the duchess's chair, and not know where to put their faces, and I watched my duke stand at the head of his table before they had well sat down and lift his glass, and say a thing I will carry to my grave. "You will forgive me," he said, in that quiet voice that made a room go still, "if I do not make a long speech. I was never gifted at them, but I find I want to say, while you are all gathered, why Miss Pell sits where she sits tonight." He looked down the table at them, at all the fine dismissing faces of the valley, and there was nothing cruel in his look, which somehow made it land the harder. Some weeks ago a good many of us stood on a river bank in the dark. There was a child in the water. And every one of us who stood on that bank made in that moment a choice, whether the child was worth the cold and the dark and the risk. Most of us chose the bank. I will not pretend I am proud of how long it took even me to move. He paused. One person did not stand on the bank. One person did not stop to reckon the cost or to ask whether the child was anybody or whether she herself was anybody. She simply went. And in the going she showed the rest of us, more plainly than a sermon ever could, the difference between rank and worth. I have dined in this valley with men of the oldest blood in England who I would not trust to carry my coat. And I have watched a schoolmistress with no name and no fortune do the finest thing I have seen done since I left the wars. He raised his glass a little higher. To Miss Marion Pell, who taught this whole valley its letters and then, when it mattered, taught it something better. There is no such thing as nobody. Drink. They drank, what else could they do? And I watched Marion through it all, scarlet to the ears, staring down at her plate, mortified nearly past bearing to be so spoken of, and I watched my duke see her mortification, and I watched him do the kind thing, the human thing, the thing that told me more than all his fine words how far the river had carried him. He leaned to her under the noise of the toast, and said something low that only she could hear, and whatever it was, it made her, even scarlet, even overwhelmed, laugh. A real laugh, surprised out of her. And he sat back looking quietly like a man who has just done the one thing he most wanted to do in all the world. I asked him later what he'd said to her. "I told her," he said, "that she looked as though she would rather be back in the weir, and that I understood the feeling entirely, and that we might escape to the stables together the moment the cheese was cleared." "And will you?" "We did," he said. "She likes the gray likes her. I find," he said, and it was the nearest to happy I had heard him since we were young men, "that I like anything the gray likes." I could tell you of the autumn that followed, of how the schoolmistress became, without anyone quite deciding it, a fixture at Greywater. How the Mendied Tithe Barn School somehow acquired a stove, and slates enough for every child, and a second teacher to help her, all of it arriving from the great house with no note attached, as if roofs and stoves and helpers simply grew there. I could tell you how the Duke took to writing down of an afternoon on the flimsiest pretexts, a question about the school, a matter of the flood repair, a book he thought her children might like, and how he would stand at the back of the barn too big for the little benches, listening to her teach, and how the children stopped being frightened of the war Duke somewhere around the third week, when one of the smallest of them climbed into his lap during a reading lesson and fell asleep there. And he sat for an hour without moving so as not to wake her. I could tell you of the winter, and the courtship that was not called a courtship, both of them too careful, too aware of the distance the world put between a duke and a schoolmistress, to name the thing that was so plainly growing. She would not presume. He would not press. It was the most patient, the most tender, the most maddeningly slow thing I ever watched, two proud, careful souls, each certain they had no right to the other, circling a fire they were both too honest to deny and too humble to claim. It broke, as these things do, over something small. It was a February evening, hard frost, and word came up to the house that the ice was thick on the mill pond, and the village children had gone out on it, and one of them had gone through. And I watched my Duke go white to the lips and call for the gray before the messenger had finished, and I understood, and I think in that moment he understood too, exactly, and past all his careful denying, what she had come to be to him, for it was not the child he had gone white for. It was that she would be there. She would be on that ice. Because of course she would. There was never any question but that Marion Pell would be first out on the ice after a drowning child, that being precisely and unchangeably who she was, the thing that had nearly killed her once and would go on being true every day of her life. The child was got out safe. She had him by the collar before the Duke even reached the pond, lying flat on the ice the way you must, spreading her weight, hauling him back from the black hole by main will. But when the Duke came off the gray and onto the ice and reached her and got them both to the bank, he did not let her go afterward. He stood on the frozen edge of the mill pond with the rescued child already running to its mother and the whole white winter world around them, and he kept his hands on her shoulders, and I, discreet at a distance, saw him say something to her at last that he had been 3 seasons not saying. I did not hear the words. I did not need to. I saw her face. I saw her shake her head, the old reflex, I am nobody, your grace. You cannot mean it, and I saw him take her face in his 2 hands gently, the way he had pressed the river out of her once, and I saw him say it again, whatever it was, slower, so there could be no mistaking it. And I saw her stop shaking her head. I saw her go very still. And I saw her, at the last, lift her own cold hand and lay it over his where it cupped her face, which is a thing a woman does only when she has finally, wholly, let herself believe. They were married in the spring in the little valley church, and if the gentry had thoughts about a duke wedding a schoolmistress, they had learned by then to keep them behind their teeth, for the whole rest of the valley would have carried the pair of them to the altar on their shoulders if the custom allowed it. The Croft child walking now, and named by its mother's insistence, Marion scattered the flowers badly, mostly on her own head. I stood up beside my Duke as I had stood beside him on harder ground, and when she came up the aisle to him in a gown that was fine at last, but no finer than the woman in it, I saw the man I had followed through 3 campaigns, the cold man, the feared man, the man with the Book of the Dead. I saw him look at her coming toward him, and I saw every one of those old ghosts let go of him at once. He kept the ledger. I want to say that because it is true and because it matters. He did not become a man with no sorrows. Those are not made and would not be worth much if they were. He kept the book of the men he had lost and read it still on the bad nights. But he told me once, years on, both of us gray, the 2 of us watching from the terrace while the new Duchess of Greywater taught a pack of valley children their letters on the lawn, her own 2 among them now. He told me that the book had changed its meaning for him. It used to be a list of everyone I could not save, he said. I read it to punish myself with it. And then one night in the river there was one I could, one the whole world had written off, one more nobody the water meant to take, and I got there in time. 9 miles and the weir, and I got there in time. He was quiet, watching her on the lawn, the low sun in her hair. I read the book differently now, Elias. I read it as the reason I did not stand on the bank. Every name in it put me on that horse. They are why I was in the river. He was silent a while. A man cannot save the dead, he said. I learned that the hard way, and it near hollowed me out. But he can, now and again, if he is quick and he does not count the cost, he can save the living. And I have found that is enough to build a whole life on. I have found it is very nearly the only thing worth building one on at all. Down on the lawn she looked up and found him watching, the way she always somehow did, and she lifted her hand to him, the small brave gesture of a woman who once believed she was no one, waving up at her own husband across a green lawn full of their children. And I watched the War Duke of Greywater lift his hand and wave back, and I thought that of all the things I had followed that man toward across all those years, this was the only one that had ever been worth arriving at. She had gone into the river because a child was worth the cold and the dark. He had gone in after her because she was. And the whole valley learned it between them and never quite forgot that there is no such thing, there was never any such thing, as a soul who is nobody, and that the surest way to find out what a person is worth is to watch who goes into the water and who stays dry upon the bank. I stayed dry that night upon the bank. I have never been sorry I followed the man who did not, and I have never in all my long life seen anything to touch the sight of him coming up out of that weir on his knees in the racing water, half drowned himself, refusing to open his arms, holding on, against the whole weight of the river, to the one the world had thrown away.